In this screencast, we're going to talk about the motivation of sex and how that affects us in a variety of ways. Research, it's kind of interesting because research on sex was kind of off limits for many, many years. And it wasn't until about the 1950s that we had our first actual research being done on sexual behavior. Like hunger, sex is one of those that when we think about it, it has biological aspects to it, genetic aspects, and psychosocial motives. So again, this is one that it's kind of unique, and we tend to study this quite a bit. Now, I said that nobody really researched sex in particular until the 1950s, and that's when Alfred Kinsey at IU, Indiana University, began doing a major study on various sexual practices. He did interviews with over 18,000 people and published, a couple different books that became bestsellers. Now, the thing about Kinsey, though, he really, it was not a very scientific group of people. He had a huge overrepresentation of people like prisoners who he could easily contact and were willing to talk about things like this, prostitutes, homosexuals. But he totally omitted African Americans. His sample obviously was not representative of the population. Now, he also had some very strange practices, but he encouraged his staff to participate in various activities along with subjects, and he videoed some of those things. Very strange. There is a movie now that's out called Kinsey, and it's one of those that you may want to check out if you're interested in this research. Now, in the 1960s, Masters and Johnson set out to look at the physiological aspect of sex. In other words, what takes place physically. Much of their research, believe it or not, consisted of direct observation. Over 10,000 orgasms that they witnessed. And what they did, the results of their research was published in The Human Sexual Response in 1966. And they essentially said that there are different stages that that people go through when they're engaged in sexual behavior. Now, the first stage is the initial excitement, and they noticed increased blood flow to the genitals, among other things. Okay. Second stage is the plateau phase, and that's where excitement continues to build and build and build, and eventually it peaks, and then the next thing you know is orgasm occurs. An orgasm involves not just muscle contractions around the genital regions, but also muscle contractions that take place throughout the entire body. Um, a male tends to experience one orgasm, or generally is capable of experiencing one orgasm in a sexual experience, whereas females can experience multiple orgasms. Now, following this, there is a resolution phase, along with the refractory period. Now, during the resolution phase, everything tends to slow down, relax, and so forth. Men, we talked about the refractory period. Men are actually incapable of having another orgasm for, it could be as, anywhere from like 30 minutes up to maybe even over a day, depending on the male. Females don't tend to experience as much of a refractory period. Again, they're capable of multiple orgasms during an experience, and then they can have more orgasms in a shorter amount of time. Now, hormones also play a major role in terms of our interest in sex and a variety of things. Hormones obviously have kind of a genetic and biological aspect to them. Now, When we talk about hormones, okay, the two biggies in terms of sex are testosterone for men and estrogen for females. And higher levels of either one of these tend to increase interest in sex. If you remember, when you were younger in elementary school, when boys and girls had cooties and you didn't want to hang around with them, had no interest in them. But the next thing you know is during junior high or right around the time of puberty, that's when these hormones tend to hit. And the next thing you know is people have a whole lot more interest in sexual behavior. Now, they've actually done research with females and found that they are much more receptive to sexual overtures and things of that nature during the time around ovulation. So, about the 14th day of their cycle, 13th, 14th, 15th day, they've done research and found that their behavior changes, even their clothing sometimes changes, a variety of things, but they're much more receptive. So this occurs in males and females in terms of the hormones. Now, occasionally you'll hear somebody say something like, "Oh, my hormones made me do it." Well, that's absolutely false. Hormones can cause you to be interested in sexual activity, but they cannot cause you to have sex. There's a variety of psychosocial factors when it comes to this behavior. Explicit images. You see a lot of this in the media, whether it be television, magazines, movies, commercials, all this kind of stuff. Now, people can, some people see these images as pleasing, others see them as disturbing, but it doesn't matter how you see them in that regard. Nonetheless, they can be biologically arousing to people. There's other things in culture, whether it be media, family, religion, culture, all of that, that play a role in how we view sexual behavior and what should be acceptable, what should not be acceptable. Those types of things there's so many different factors that affect that. The TV show Friends, okay, this is just kind of a humorous example, but um, China, the government in China rules what's on TV. They control and give the okay or not okay to what's on TV in China. And when they were considering allowing the TV show Friends to be shown in China, the government took a look at the show and they started thinking, wow, there's a whole lot of sexual connotations and things in that show. So what they started doing is they thought, well, okay, they could just cut out those parts of the TV show. Well, once they did that, they found there was nothing left. There wasn't enough of a show to really show. So Friends did not get the okay from the Chinese government. Now, sexual orientation, that's the other thing we'll talk about here. And sexual orientation tends to kind of come out or display itself around the time of adolescence. And that's why I think a lot of times people over the years have thought, oh, that's when a person so-called chooses to be either heterosexual or homosexual. But research has shown that's just not true. Okay. Yes, this is when, during puberty, that's the time period when people start to kind of show their orientation. But sexual orientation, there's no research whatsoever that shows that it is a choice. It's basically, something that's already been fixed in terms of genetics and biology. So when we take a look at that, no evidence has shown this in any way, shape, or form. It's not like there's a switch that a person can kind of turn that makes them one way or another. A lot of times, years ago, there was a lot of concern about children being raised by gay parents. Well, thinking, oh, that would make all the children gay and so forth. That has not been found to be true at all. And essentially, again, it's a biologically determined thing, which goes right along with the research of Simon LeVay. Simon LeVay is the one that discovered that there's actually a difference in the hypothalamus of men and women. In other words, he found not only, well, other researchers have found things too, but not only the hypothalamus, but there's a difference between a typical male brain and a typical female brain. But one of the things that's different is the hypothalamus. And they found that, for example, a homosexual man tends to have more of a physical female brain, whereas a homosexual female has more of a man's brain. So it's kind of interesting how that occurs. And all the research tends to point to various things that occurred during the development, the prenatal development. And it has to do with the amount of testosterone and or estrogen that's involved in the prenatal environment. So one of the things that might have an effect is the levels of stress. For example, they did research on people in England. Oh, goodness, I'm going back in history now. I think it was the summer of 1940 that Germany, it was prior to World War I breaking out in Germany, just they were basically having bombing raids over England, over Britain, day after day after day after day, and people were having, extreme high levels of stress during that time period. And what they found was that women who were pregnant during that time period, their children had an extremely high rate of homosexuality in those children. So there's some research that indicates that maybe even stress has an impact on the hormone levels. And scientists have actually been able to create homosexual male fruit flies and lesbian sheep. And they've done that by controlling the prenatal environment and being able to control the levels of hormones during the prenatal development. So, all right, let's stop at that point.